welcome to this episode of The Classical Tradition, where we're going to talk about how the Renaissance took on the form of the epic in poetry and tried to use the new structures and frameworks that it had understood because of the emergence of greater classical understanding in the time of the Renaissance, and then inserted that into a form of poetry, the epic, which we've already seen before, right? We've seen it it survived throughout the Dark Ages. Think Beowulf, or in the Middle Ages, think Dante's Divine Comedy. In its own way, was epical in framework, even though Dante had the confusion around classifying it as a comedy. Or also in the Middle Ages, Petrarch's Africa. So let's talk about the four separate classes of vernacular Renaissance epic that we had. The first one's the most simple. It's the direct imitation of classical epic, which is represented by Pierre de Ronsard's Franchiade. In the Franchiade, Pierre de Ronsard tells of how Astyanax, son of Hector, leaves and escapes Troy and then goes to found the city of Paris as sort of a Gaullist nation, that kernel of French civilization. So he's going for the same theme exactly and the same storytelling of what Virgil has already done prior. He's even doing it as an inspiration for the death of Charles IX as Ronsard, similar to how Virgil would have done it for Emperor Augustus. So it's kind of a one-to-one graph of, I'm going to take the exact same way of telling this story and place it to France. It's similar to what we saw in Geoffrey of Monmouth's telling of how Brutus left Troy and went to England. So both civilizations, England and France, there looking for the epic way of telling story, which is a direct interpretation and imitation of Virgil. The second type is the epics on contemporary heroes or heroic adventures. And for this, we go to Portugal and Spain, because it's in Portugal and Spain that we saw the greatest exploratory phase of any of the Western nations in the early 16th century, with their route around Cape of Good Hope towards India, and also their exploration of South America. Each of these adventures feed back into the minds and imaginations of the poets of Portugal and Spain, so that they can begin to work on epics but using contemporary heroism. Let's take a look at example of The Sons of Lucis, Os Luciados, by Louis de Camões in 1572, which is probably the best and most cohesive work of this class. Then much more simpler in terms of style, we've got the poem of Araucania, La Araucania, by Alonso de Urquía y Zuniga, and then which is on one of the conquistadors of South America. It shows the resistance of Chilean Indians. It's broken down by Spanish invaders. Its influence can be seen from Don Quixote, when the curate and the barber are sort of throwing out the trash of his library. They decide to keep La Araucania, saying it was one of the three best heroic poems by the Spanish. And a third and final example is La Dragontía, which is by Lope de Vega, which is the telling of the last voyage of that and death of the devilish dragon Sir Francis Drake. The third type is probably the most successful. It's the romantic epics that still contain in them the morality and heart of a medieval chivalric tale. So, romantic epic with medieval chivalry. These are still contained considerable classical influence, though, despite the fusion of chivalric romance as we had earlier. It's like a blend of knightly adventure, romantic love stories, and then Greco-Roman enrichments. So the best known of these internationally is probably The Madness of Roland, Orlando Furioso, published early in the 16th century, 1516, by Ludovico Ariosto, based on the Saracen invasion of France. Loosely, Maury wants to put a phantasmagoria of love and adventure and sort of chivalric escapades tied up into this cavalcade of cantos. It's not very well organized, but it is better organized than what we would have seen earlier. For instance, from A Romance of the Rose, or something like this. So he does take on Ariosto inspiration from a late 15th century work called Orlando Innamorato, which is by Matteo Maria Baiardo. But then to rival Ariosto in art and to surpass him in earnestness is Spenser, Edmund Spenser, who completes his Faerie Queene in the late 16th century, publications lapping a little bit into the early 17th century in the last part of Elizabethan England, the last decades of it. He writes 6 books of an intended 12, in which he's trying to sculpt onto adventures of Arthurian knights in this fairyland, his idealized chivalric version of England that he sculpted for himself. He's trying to fuse Aristotelian virtues and morality into an adventure. Each book will contain an adventure of a single knight who's meant to embody a single virtue, and then go up against a certain vice, which is the antithesis to that virtue. That's where the Aristotelian element comes in. As well as Ariosto, there are strong elements, though, of Homer and Virgil in this, as well as Boccaccio's Theseid, and also present in it is inspiration from the intermediary of the 3 big writers in this class of Renaissance epic, which is Torquato Tasso and his Liberation of Jerusalem. So the Liberation of Jerusalem by Torquato Tasso comes in the middle of the 16th century, and it takes as its ideal as its chivalric ideal, the First Crusade and the adventures on the First Crusade. Similar to Ariosto, but there's an important introduction, which is the Christian doctrine into the epic, which isn't really prevalent in Ariosto. It's also influenced by a lesser work called The Liberation of Italy from the Goths, La Italia Liberata dai Goti, by Giovan Giorgio Tersino, which tells of how the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian came in and tried to push the Goths out of Italy. So what's interesting about Tasso's work is that it's trying to turn the crusade into the epic creating moment, rather than what we had with Ronsard's Frankiad, which is still trying to ape what Virgil had done 1500 years earlier and have some escape the Trojan War and then go and found a new civilization. The founding of the new civilization from Tasso's point of view is the Western European Catholic Christian civilization, which is formed through the great exploration and push forward of the Crusades. The final class is the Christian religious epic, which it takes elements of Tasso, but it loses sort of the chivalric ideal and keeps all the Christian elements in it for a full Christian epic telling. You can kind of think of it as these are the 4 stages, and almost the civilization is trying to get to that 4th stage. And that 4th stage, of course, is Milton, and it comes last 17th century. Milton's Paradise Lost and his Paradise Regained, published 1667 and 1671, in which the epics are played out on myths of Judeo-Christian origin, but were arranged in a classical manner. So in all of the above works, Milton is a character, because he's in the 17th century, you can think of him possibly beginning to have Baroque elements, and we'll get into the Baroque later. But really, his epics are bookend onto the classes of epic which emerged in the Renaissance. Of all of the epics we discussed above, only 2 had were classical in their subject matter: Frankiad of Ronsard and the Theseid of Boccaccio. The former is a failure, and the latter is still prominently a medieval writing and style. So what we get from examining these 4 classes is that success came from, not from aping Virgil or aping the epics, but from understanding their structure, which you can also think of in architecture, how you didn't just want to ape Vitruvius, but you wanted to understand him. Did away with what the structure could do. It could do away with wandering incoherence. So it's the same thing we saw in Renaissance drama, where the 5-act structure comes in. In the Renaissance epic, they get a much better idea of how to structure things into cantos and books, and then the separate stanzas. Think of Spenser's Faerie Queene, where he's using his own Spenserian sonnet as a verse, but that has come up through Petrarch, and Petrarch, steeped in learning, has given structure and greater understanding to Spenser. So the classical tradition has helped fuse a greater structure of epic, which can keep the whole thing together in a much more cohesive manner than anything we saw in Middle Ages, where the Romance of the Rose has two authors and it's all over the place, despite having kernels of Ovid in there and so on. And then that work done by Spenser, Ariosto Tasso, is then finalized by Milton, who by the mid to late 17th century has sort of detached himself of some of the chivalric romance elements and does a pure Christian epic of Satan and the fall from heaven, and then also the exit of the Garden of Eden by Adam and Eve, and then Paradise Regained. In that, he hasn't just regained paradise for himself, but what he's done is he's inculcated a new and confident form of epic, which the Renaissance was always trying to go towards, and then it culminates in Milton. So next we're going to delve into a bit more supernatural elements that are in these works, the heroic prophetic deeds that occur, and also some other things such as travel and the portrayal of women, just to greater flesh out what is actually inside the content of these epics which we've just classed. So until then.